Hi, everyone. This is our third recording on the U.S. Constitution from Chapter 2 in your text. This recording will be focusing on the outcome of the Constitution, some of the features of the Constitution, how that applies for us today. So primarily then we're going to focus on these features of the U.S. Constitution. All right, so in the last few pages, or the latter third of Chapter 2, you can see then a way of looking at the features of the Constitution, viewing amendments to the Constitution, the different roles of the branches of government that are defined in the Constitution. And also you can see the ways to change the Constitution, the amendments. So how did we get to that point? We've covered some of that area already, but your book does go into some detail about other individuals who helped shape the creation of the Constitution, or shaped how the Constitution became the document that it is. So we've got to assume that the people who were writing the Constitution, they were going to clearly have been influenced by other people that they had studied, or were just considered to be important individuals that you needed to know to be involved in lawmaking and governing. One of those individuals was a French writer and philosopher named Montesquieu, and you can read about Montesquieu, pages 54 and 55 in your text. And he had been influenced before he started to write by the Greek philosopher, to be more particular, the Macedonian philosopher Aristotle, that we have mentioned once before, looking at his viewpoints about governing, that there should be balances of power, that no one group or individual should have too much power. And Montesquieu enhanced those viewpoints for perhaps a more modern audience at the time. And again, this idea of no single person or group should have too much power or influence. And in a way, this is not exactly a complete comparison or accurate comparison, but just in a way, consider that if one person would only consume one type of food and would only have one nutrient, would that make that person in some ways unbalanced, right? Could it create some health problems as a result? And so even though there may be some foods out there, the sweet potato comes to mind, that might be able to, you could actually live off that one food. But in most cases, you can't really do that. And so you need to have a balance in your nutrition. And so is governing in some ways similar, that there needs to be a balance. And so that's the idea there with Montesquieu. No single person or group should have too much power. So we know in our system that we have three branches of government, and the most dominant power within each one of those branches could be used as a way to balance out the power of the other branches. So when you come back to considering ultimately what is the most important power of the legislative branch, Congress, it's the power of the purse. And that power is brought out through the budget or through taxes. And we know that the use of money is a very influential power. The executive branch, which is most represented by the president, and that most dominant power can be identified as the power of the sword. And you can see that through the commander-in-chief role. In charge of all the generals, admirals are to answer to the president. all parts of the military can be used by the president. Now, we'll see some distinctions there in terms of the roles of these other branches of government, but we can see here through the use of the military, the president can have considerable power. In the judicial branch, that power, which is best illustrated in the Supreme Court, although you can see that power brought out also in other federal courts, but it's the power of judgment. And that's most described through judicial review. Now, it is worth noting that judicial review is not found in the Constitution. That's been a traditional interpretation that the Supreme Court would have that power in other federal courts. And it was first determined to have, for the courts to have that power in the court case Marbury v. Madison, as you see there. And you can read about that on page 57 in your text. So as you look over these powers, just consider how one branch of government could be used to limit the power of the other branches. So there's an excellent chart on page 60 that will show you the ways in which there can be checks and balances, and where one branch of government can limit the power of another branch. Now, one that's not really brought out on that chart, and I can understand why the authors of your text didn't really bring that out, because it's not something that we've really seen in our history where there's been this conflict between these two branches. So when war has happened, there has been a general agreement between Congress and the president. But notice there could be a way for Congress to limit the power of the president in that commander-in-chief role. The Congress could determine that they didn't declare war, and therefore the president can't really use the military in a particular setting. Now, many times the president has used the military without a formal declaration of war. In fact, most times. But that could possibly be a way for Congress to limit the power of the president. In many ways, when you look over these different powers, you can come back to a determination that it's not as if each branch of government is really equal. You can see how each branch can be used to limit the power of other branches. But if Congress wanted to exert its most powerful influences all the time, it could limit the power of the other two branches of government. Certainly could limit the power of the president. But in many cases that Congress determines or just does not have enough unity to be able to carry out that kind of power against the president. How about we'll pause here, and you can think of some ways perhaps in which one branch of government can limit the power of another branch. And we'll look over some of your examples that you put together on chat. So your text then goes into detail of describing some of the features of the U.S. Constitution and just some brief descriptions here about those. So please spend some time looking over what's described there in your text. But the Constitution is the supreme law. So there is not any law put together in any other governmental document in the United States that can supersede the United States Constitution. And in a way, is that the efficient way to run a government? There has to be one document that's superior to every other document. So you can't make a law that is in some ways in conflict with the supremacy clause. The Ottawa County couldn't do that. Miami couldn't do that. Tulsa couldn't do that. Oklahoma, New York City, any other type of government from a state, local perspective, that can't happen. Now, maybe it's going on without an interpretation by the courts, but still, ideally, it is the U.S. Constitution that is to have the supreme power and supreme interpretation over other laws. As we mentioned, there's a separation of powers, so there's not all power given to one branch of government. There is some balance, although there can be situations, again, in which that balance is not really found if Congress is to carry out all its actions. After all, Congress can impeach and remove a president. They can impeach and remove judges. They can declare war. They can raise taxes. So you can see there's considerable power for Congress. But we also have federalism. And so that's where you can see state governments that can be different for one another. We've seen differences among the states in enforcing different policies about the coronavirus. We can see differences among the states in enforcing laws about the use of marijuana. So we can see differences there among the states. And then that difference can also trickle down to local governments, county governments, city governments. So you may see some differences among counties and cities, what's enforced within the boundaries of those local governments. And again, that'll be something that's brought out in your city council projects that you'll have with your groups. There are rights among the individuals. We'll really discuss this when we cover Chapter 4. So we're looking at the Bill of Rights. So Chapter 3 will be federalism, and Chapter 4 will be the Bill of Rights. What rights do individuals have, and how are those rights to be interpreted? And then we'll also bring out, in some cases with Chapter 4, the situation about our Constitution, which is an interesting contribution made here when you consider the way many governments operated at the time in which the Constitution was written, that the Constitution is a secular document. So there is no mention of God in the Constitution. There's no mention of an official church or religion. There is no requirement for a person to be religious. There's no requirement for a person to believe in a God. And so there we can see a very powerful contribution made by the United States Constitution. Again, it's something that is still to this day rather unique, but certainly was pretty unique in the time in which it was written, that this is a secular document, non-religious document. And that doesn't mean that it's anti-religious, but it certainly means that it is not endorsing one religion over another, or even the concept of religion. Now, again, as we've talked about, just in the slide before, we mentioned this issue of the Bill of Rights, the rights of the individuals. That was a consequence of this debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were opposed to the new Constitution, where the Federalists were in support. And so certainly focus on these pages as you read about that debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. One of their main areas dealt with, should there be rights that are documented in the Constitution for individuals, that you can then recognize that you have freedom of religion. Now, one way to interpret that is whatever is not mentioned in the Constitution, that means that you have that right. So in other words, there were Federalists that were supporting the idea that there did not need to be a mention of freedom of religion, because after all, since if it's not mentioned, that means you have it. So the Constitution also doesn't mean that, the Constitution also doesn't state that you have the right to breathe air, but does it need to mention that? But there were enough individuals arguing to say, we don't know what this society will be like in 50 or 100 years. So the rights for the individuals need to be clarified to some degree, and some basic rights need to be stated. And those are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. So this is one of those segments of one of the amendments in the Bill of Rights. The Eighth Amendment, and that's word for word what you see for the Eighth Amendment. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So let's think about that Eighth Amendment and then answer in chat. In what ways would this amendment be used in our society or legal system today? How does this apply? Not necessarily all parts of the Constitution are that used or are necessary. Using the word necessary seems to be a little fuzzy there, but we just don't apply all parts of the Constitution in our modern society. But this part we probably do. So how would it apply? How do we use this Eighth Amendment? Go ahead and share some thoughts there on chat. And then last, we have here changes to the Constitution. How can you go about making changes to the Constitution? This is part of the debate, and I guess I show partly my viewpoints here about the Constitution. I view that by the mere fact that there is an amendment process, it does suggest that the Constitution is a living document, that it is continuing to expand, that it can attempt to cover and adapt to different changes in society. And that's where it can change through the amendment process. It doesn't change very easily, but it can go through that process. So you can see what the definition of an amendment would be, and then you can also see the amendment process. The amendment process, even though there are 4 different ways to carry out a change in the Constitution through the amendment process, really only one way has been primarily used, and that's mentioned in these pages 65 through 66. But let's spend some time here thinking about this, and again, share this in chat as well. What amendments would you suggest? Do you have in your mind here, or at least again write it in your notes? What would you like to see added to the Constitution or changed in the Constitution? So it's either an addition or a change to a document. That's an amendment. All right, we'll stop there. And some ways of looking at the U.S. Constitution. So our next week, our next set of recordings, we'll look over federalism from chapter 3.